Show me a starfighter. Нет, show me a real starfighter. Perfection. Привет everyone! Welcome back once again to the Soviet Union. Now with 40% more carbs, 60% less mass murder, and one Sputnik.
Beep, 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 beep.
Thanks, Nikita. Very cool. In the most recent episode of the horrible history of Russian fighter jets, at time of recording anyway, we covered the creation of the Soviet Air Defense Forces and the development of their various interceptors. A few of them good, most of them not. Yet the times, as the song famously goes, were a-changin'. And in the new industrious era of the Khrushchev Kremlin, the Soviet Union experienced a massive growth in both quality of life and technological development. Turns out when they aren't afraid of getting shot for experimenting, taking risks with their ideas, or not doing exactly what they're told, or just breathing if we're being honest, Soviet scientists and engineers are actually rather brilliant. They still don't have a proper budget, but being communists, that kinda comes with the territory. And they would need to be brilliant, as trying to match the juggernaut that was the American military-industrial complex with 3 rubles, 2 paperclips, and a stick would take a Herculean effort of engineering. Especially now, considering. Fortunately for our comrades in the Comintern, however, they had an incredible idea. An interceptor for the coming age. An interceptor for the space age. Which, seeing as we are capitalists, I will tell you about right after a word from our sponsor. Comrades, this video is sponsored by NordVPN. If you've been watching my channel for a while, you'll know that they've been my VPN of choice for over 5 years, and for very good reason. NordVPN is affordable, efficient, and effective. They have servers all over the world, giving you access to region-locked content, and their website contains every piece of information, as well as all the resources required to guard your privacy while browsing. And given my job means I regularly browse the Russian side of the internet, I can vouch for their efficacy. Their plans cover multiple devices with a dedicated app for every device that can share data as well as files using their meshnet system. And it has a full suite of security features, including a dark web tracker, comprehensive anti-malware, and browser protection, all of it backed up by 24/7 customer support. Plus, they have a 30-day money-back guarantee if you don't like it, so there's no risk in trying them. Just click the link in the description and get 4 months extra on a 2-year plan when you sign up. It helps me, and it will definitely help you. And now, back to the video. Gotta love capitalism, right? Anyway, where were we? Yes. As the 1960s approached, so did a new wave of skunkwork superweapons that struck terror into the Soviet leadership. The U-2 spy plane was still launching infrequent incursions into Soviet territory, despite the threat of Lavashkin's new flying telephone pole, the SA-2 Divina, or Guideline. The F-104 Starfighter was setting speed and altitude records that made the Yak-25 look utterly inadequate and, quite honestly, rather silly, and Lockheed was exporting them to what appeared to be the entirety of NATO. Granted, that was due to a massive corruption scandal, but the point still stands. Yet the most terrifying threat of them all, the single most terrifying threat, were the rumors circulating among their various intelligence assets that the legendary Kelly Johnson himself was working on a new project that could go Mach 3 on the edge of space, carrying cameras or even extremely long-range missiles that absolutely nothing in the Soviet Air Forces could touch. Combine that with the triple threat of the B-58 Hustler, the experimental XB-70 Valkyrie, and of course Grandpa Buff, and the air defense forces of the PVO were facing a strategic picture that was starting to look incredibly bleak. The Yak-25 and the MiG-19 were showing their age, despite being relatively new, and while more advanced fighters were in development, they were designed to support the Red Army in a do-or-die charge across the Folder Gap, not wage war on the edge of space. And even with a dedicated interceptor variant, the brand new MiG-21 just couldn't compete with that sort of speed and altitude. Then there was the issue with weapons. The first generation of Soviet air-to-air missiles were, like their Western counterparts, utter dogshit. However, while the US was ploughing ahead in their program for what would become the AIM-7 Sparrow, the Soviets were, as always, lagging behind in the high-technology sector when it came to electronics and computing. It's not that they didn't know how to design and build these systems, though. Rather, it was how to manufacture them, and in this regard, their biggest disadvantage was miniaturization. Now, they did have their intelligence organs working on this, and they did indeed get lucky with their infrared missile program. But we shall cover that story in the main Soviet Aviation series. Spoiler alert, it involved crime. A lot of crime, and a bit of mail fraud. But anyway, what's important here is the Soviets had enough knowledge and experience to develop a new series of radar-guided missiles. Furthermore, they had a brand new suite of advanced tactical equipment to mount on their fighters. The problem was, as we've established, the Soviets don't have the manufacturing expertise or the technology to make these systems effective and small. It has to be one or the other. And simple arithmetic, as well as the laws of physics, will tell you that the more mass something has, the heavier it is. And excess weight is the mortal enemy of aviation. Yet the natural question upon receiving all of this information is that what was this new equipment? Well, aside from the latest series of air intercept radars, which in keeping with the theme of precious gemstones was codenamed Almaz or Diamond, the Soviets had developed a clever solution to get around their deficiency in technology. Yes, their technology is heavy, bulky, and unsuitable for mounting on aircraft. However, most of that equipment is the information processing and onboard computers. That's the heavy stuff. Converting the radar and weapon systems data into actionable feedback to the pilot, and then the pilot's commands back to them, was the problem. So the Soviets had an idea. Something that in our day and age seems obvious, but back then was revolutionary. What if all the complex targeting, navigation, computing, and processing, all the stuff that takes up all the diodes and punch cards and all that technical stuff, what if all of that could be done on the ground using massive mainframes and then relayed in real time to the aircraft? Then all they would need to do is put the radar and a receiver on board, which could display the information to the pilot and then send the raw data back, which is then processed and sent back refined, etc. In short, a data link. This is something they had been considering for a while. The whole of Soviet society operated entirely on the plan, as it were. There were so many central committees and subcommittees that there were committees on founding committees. This, quite naturally, bled into their military thinking alongside the established Soviet way of war, pioneered by Frunze and Tukhachevsky, namely, deep battle and the calculus of the correlation of forces, which prioritized logistical and operational efficiency to coordinate multiple large-scale combat operations simultaneously to break through, overwhelm, and ultimately destroy the enemy. Large frontal operations. To achieve this requires being able to coordinate your forces down to every minute detail, as every component of an operation fits into every other part. Combine this with a government-owned command economy, and you get a holistic, comprehensive doctrine based around centralized command and control. And to achieve that goal in the Air Defense Forces, the PVO poured all their efforts into the creation of an automated Ground Control Intercept System, or GCI system, for the Soviet Union's integrated air defense network. Trying to command each individual aircraft in the unrestricted chaos of air-to-air combat is a fool's endeavor using conventional methods. You would need a ground control intercept officer or radar controller for each flight of aircraft, let alone maybe even each individual aircraft. And in the case of a full-scale war, an engagement could involve thousands of planes. Even for the Soviets, that is an organizational and manpower expense way too far. Thus, the Soviet GCI system needed a complete overhaul in order to automate it, so their commanders could precisely and accurately automate the command and control functions of their GCI network. And I have absolutely no idea about how any of it worked or how they did it. There are no English sources. The few lines there are in Yefim Gordon's book are like, just a page or two. And the Russian ones I did find are fragmented to hell and very vague. It's a complete mess. It's never been properly documented, so I don't have the knowledge or the research to explain any of this. Thankfully, though, I know someone who does.
To understand the importance of GCI, one must understand the reality of what the situation in the air would look like during a Third World War. Firstly, air defense in Europe would be extremely complex. the saturation of surface-to-air missiles would be so great that neither side would be able to reliably interdict one another without significant losses being incurred. This applies to both sides, but it is especially grim for NATO, who would have to deal with a significant number of unique systems, all operating in tandem with overlapping coverage. This is by no means to say that the USSR and its allies will not struggle to penetrate Western air defense. To give an example, this is what it would look like to fly over 1st Army Corps. While flying low to the ground helps to reduce the threat posed by long-range SAM systems, it does not prevent one from being engaged by manpads, anti-aircraft artillery, and other short-range weapons designed for low-altitude engagements. Much of these systems are placed forward and would be encountered well before Hawk, 2K-12, or 2K-11. These SAMs, optimized for medium-altitude targets, are placed in such a way that flying within their engagement envelope is effectively impossible without being destroyed. On both sides of the Iron Curtain, they are intended to intercept opposing aircraft after they have made it past the previously mentioned threats, as anything that hopes to evade them with altitude would be immediately fired upon. It is for this reason that any operation in the air would seek to target objects that make the risk worth the reward, primarily exceedingly valuable strategic assets. These large-scale breaching maneuvers would involve a huge number of aircraft and would be the primary application of anti-radiation missiles, as there were more radars in Europe than NATO and the Warsaw Pact's combined availability of these munitions. The necessity of carving out corridors using huge surges of air power would reasonably justify their cost. I need to reiterate once again that it would genuinely be suicidal to do anything less, and both sides generally agreed on this principle. The need to manage this impossibly complex battlefield on the ground and in the air made many conventional solutions to this problem obsolete. No human being could reasonably process the amount of information and have been able to make sound decisions on top of it. Even large groups of people all working together did not possess the capability to effectively manage these assets, especially the burden of collection, assessment, transmission, and coordination with those actively engaged in the fighting. What the Soviet military needed was a series of command and control systems to automatically coordinate aircraft and surface-to-air missiles, while also providing a complete picture of the battlefield so that said sound decisions could be made. These concepts became very clear with the formation of the anti-aircraft missile troops in the mid-50s. Units operating S-25 were at this time coordinated mainly from central command posts. These command posts were not mobile, and neither was S-25. This was generally acceptable as they were deployed around priority targets like Moscow. It soon became clear that the need to move these missiles was of great importance, and with the adoption of S-75 and its low-altitude counterpart, S-75M, finalized by the end of the 50s, and with new SAM systems on the way, that being S-125 and S-200, it was becoming clear that coordination between these assets would be difficult. By 1961, with the S-200 being accepted into service, there began to exist fewer and fewer homogeneous anti-aircraft missile battalions. When these mixed battalions trained to thwart air attacks featuring 2 to 3 air targets per minute, they seldom succeeded. Luckily, in 1957, YE-5 had already begun work on a solution well before this problem had revealed itself. This solution sought to introduce a computerized system capable of assessing the productivity of each radar station attached to a unit, streamline data obtained by low and high altitude radars, and display all of this to commanders, who would then make informed decisions. This complex would also allow for the rapid transmission of data between formations so that a real-time picture of the battlefield could be obtained, allowing for certain threats to be prioritized over others. ASURK-1, as it was known, officially began development in April of 1960, and would receive much of its information from P-80 radars deployed by the formation it was attached to. This allowed for 10 targets to be tracked simultaneously by each radar cluster. Up to 8 battalions would receive these targets in real time. It was adopted in 1963 and would later go on to receive up to 5 firing channels when paired with S-200 battalions. Alongside ASURK-1, YE-5, following a decree issued April 3rd of 1953, began work on what was described as a comprehensive automated system for warning, control, and guidance of interceptors against enemy aircraft. The project was led by Colonel M.I. Mikhailov. Sources are divided on if Vosduk-1 passed state trials in 1956 or entered service in 1955. A mobile variant intended for closer use to the front, designated Vosduk-1P, was introduced alongside the stationary variant, which was for use within the USSR. This was developed by A.A. Lvovich. At this time, the P-30 was the most advanced radar that could interface with the new command system. This had a significant impact on the development of Vosduk's data processing equipment. The P-30 used 2 antenna beams inclined at 45 degrees to the plane of rotation to derive altitude. This information was obtained from the azimuthal displacement of the target mark between the main and auxiliary antenna beams. This mandated the introduction of a second screen to receive signals from both antennae, resulting in the final product featuring one display depicting azimuth and range while another showed range and altitude. represented as azimuthal displacement. To harmonize information gathered by this new data processing system called the USD with friendly fighter aircraft, a device known as Cascade was introduced to provide all three spatial coordinates. Experimental models coupling the USD with Cascade successfully transmitted encoded commands to fighter aircraft sometime around 1957, which is when they began to be mass-produced as a part of Vosduk. What is most interesting about Vosduk-1 is that while it technically entered service in the 1950s, this date is somewhat deceptive, as Vosduk-1 is a system of systems that was not actually completed until the early 60s. The first, most rudimentary iterations of the complex were designated VPT-01U and VPT-02U. They could only receive radar data, display azimuth, range, and altitude, track targets and friendly aircraft semi-automatically, and transmit this data to higher formations to create a somewhat comprehensive picture of the battlefield. This was still impressive, but not what Vosduk set out to do. It wouldn't be until 1963, with some sources stating 1965, that Vosduk-1 was truly complete. This was when VPT-04 entered service, which integrated Lazur, Cascade, ASPD-1, and Kliuch. Vosduk-1 was entirely analog, but would eventually see a complete digitalization just 10 years later, significantly increasing its capabilities. It was employed in air defense divisions and within the VVS, where it would interface with a radio technical brigade consisting of 6 to 9 radio technical battalions and 12 to 18 longitude radar companies. It is capable of exchanging information with 5 neighboring formations, each operating 8 guidance points. This allows for a combined frontage of 1,600 kilometers, allowing for an air defense army to guide 144 flights, containing 3 aircraft each. Comparing Vosduk-1 to Sage is deceptive. Not only was Vosduk capable of everything Sage could do, but it was also entirely mobile and could be repositioned in a matter of hours. Vosduk-1M, which entered service in 1971, was extremely advanced for its time. When operating along MiG-23, God's gift to aviation, it was capable of assisting the aircraft in generating a 3D track and computed kinematic launch envelope without triggering the enemy's RWR by employing very short low-power ranging pulses every 4 seconds, and extrapolating the closure in between, all of which is displayed on the aircraft's HUD. Many people ask themselves why the USSR put so much emphasis on IRST, and there are a lot of reasons for this, such as dual sensor capability and backup search and track in heavy electronic jamming environments. But one of the primary reasons for its introduction was Vosduk, which allowed for precise data link controlled approach to the target, prioritizing trajectories that maximize the chance of ambush. Low-altitude, high-speed dashes would be engaged with exceptional accuracy, allowing for pop-up attacks from the rear hemisphere, with radar emissions being delayed just before firing. In these circumstances, IRST was very valuable, as it allowed for GCI to find the target while the aircraft prepared for an ambush. This maximized the chance of success when IR missiles were employed, such as R-40T or R-23T. It can automatically plot the location of jamming and triangulate the source. It can accurately guide a flight of aircraft using entirely computer-generated commands on a route which will minimize the likelihood of contact until an ideal position to start the engagement. It can automatically hand off guidance to a more favorable collection of radars if the point guiding the flight loses the target or is affected by electromagnetic disturbance. And, like Vosduk-1P, it can be repositioned because it is entirely trailerized. I am currently working on a 4 to 5 hour video discussing the entire history of Vosduk, as well as its functionality using primary sources such as interviews with those who have used the system and assisted in its development, as well as documents dredged up from post-Soviet archives. If this interests you, it will be uploaded on my channel in a few months. ASURK-1 would eventually be replaced by Vector 2 in the early 1970s, which was designed to interface with Vosduk-1M. It was able to integrate external radar inputs and coordinate automated fire control for up to 14 S-200, S-75, and S-125 battalions in any combination, alongside 6 flights of interceptors. Its computers could distribute targets and bearings among subordinate battalions, taking into account the target's time to arrival to ensure optimal intercept conditions. Information was taken from Vosduk-1M and reflected back in real time with whatever Vector was seeing. Vosduk-1M even featured an incredibly esoteric air-to-ground mode where it could guide aircraft against targets on the ground, allowing for them to be visualized on the aircraft's HUD for maximal efficiency. Of course, in regards to Vosduk-1, the analog variant, a lot had to be done to make it small enough to move around the battlefield. It could not use a giant discrete computer like Sage, and so a lot of unique solutions had to be tried, especially in regards to its ground data link, which denotes target coordinates using a voltage, which is delivered at a speed of 60 baud. This voltage is rescaled upon arrival so that it is positionally relevant. To receive this voltage, it is binarized into 32 positive and negative pulses. As each pulse is received, they are directed to a series of 28 capacitors, used as memory so that the message can be turned back into a voltage capable of being displayed on the screens present within that command post. Coordinates are usually packaged with what is known as a correction burst to synchronize a motor on the receiving end with a motor on the distributing end. The regenerated signal is routed through a set of contacts that are actuated by 40 cams on the receiving distributor. These cams control which circuit paths are momentarily closed as the distributor rotates. The camshaft of the receiving distributor rotates at the same speed and in the same phase as the shaft of the transmitting distributor. In addition, the angular positions of the cams on the receiving distributor correspond exactly to the angular positions of the matching cams on the transmitting distributor. This ensures that each received pulse is processed at the correct moment. This motor allows for speeds of up to 1,800 RPM to be engaged. Rotation is actuated through a step-down gearbox. Each revolution takes around 533 milliseconds. Each 32-pulse signal can be received in a single rotation. The correction pulse is prepared by a tuning fork actuated by magnets connected to coils which are charged according to the required frequency on both ends, and this isn't even the weirdest part. The Cascade computer is made up entirely of motor shafts which automatically recouple themselves between guidance modes. What is going on? This is ancient Sumerian technology.
Hold on. Medics! Medics! Comrade K is delusional! Take it to the infirmary! A mechanical data link is impossible. Yet somehow it exists. And if she can't work it out, I'm not about to try. But that's not really important. What matters is, you now know and understand just how much equipment had to be mounted on these aircraft, and by extension, how much it weighs. Which means, once again, we're gonna need a bigger engine. The Soviet aviation industry, as we know, has not had the greatest track record with this enterprise, relying on foreign designs and the development of acquired technology. And these developments were never smooth sailing. Pretty much every Soviet engine design from 1917 to now went through development hell, with numerous random unscheduled disassemblies and an awful lot of spontaneous external combustions in what should have been an internal combustion engine. But by the late 1950s, they were finally starting to make some serious progress. Klimov was developing a considerably powerful afterburning turbojet in the VK-3, while the Ukrainian mad scientist Arkhip Lilka literally invented the modern doublejet turbofan, as well as churning out engines like it was going out of style, most prominently the AL-7F, powering the new Sukhoi family of interceptors. Yet the founding father of the indigenous Soviet engine industry, one A.A. Mikulin, the man who pioneered their homegrown industry, had failed to keep up with the times. His AM-5 turbojet was a nightmare of a project, with delays, setbacks, and multiple workshop explosions. Its reliability was dreadful, and the entire development process was nearly cancelled. However, miraculously, they pushed through those problems, and it became the power plant of the PVO's frontline interceptor of the late 1950s, the Yak-25, as well as the VKS's first supersonic frontline fighter, the MiG-19. But it wasn't Mikulin who achieved that miracle. On the contrary, Mikulin was removed from his post in the project's aftermath in disgrace. No, that achievement belongs to his deputy, a man brought into the Mikulin Bureau at Plant 300 over a decade prior, a man who would become a titan of the Soviet aviation industry in his own right. Because as it turns out, the famous saying, "In thrust we trust," is actually translated from an old Belarusian proverb dating back to the dawn of powered flight, and it can be directly attributed to the magician from Minsk himself, Sergei Konstantinovich Tumansky. Look at that man. When you see a man with eyebrows that can directly compete with Brezhnev, you know you are dealing with a power level way over 9,000. A power level only exceeded by his engines. And he really is the manifestation of the crystallization of Soviet aero engine design. If Mikulin was the father of the Soviet aero engine industry, Lilka was its gifted genius, Klimov its hardest worker, Shvestov its specialist problem solver, and Cheromsky, Yeah, we don't talk about Chomsky. Turbo diesel aero engines. Just no. Look up the PE-8 with those engines. Nah. No. But if all those men are the foundations on which this era of Soviet aviation is based, then Sergei Tumansky is the glue that brings them all together. He is the man who takes everything these men built and refined it into its ultimate form. He had started his designer career working on radial engines during World War II, which culminated in his M88 radial that ended up being used on the Ilyushin IL-4 medium bomber. It was this achievement that brought him to the attention of A.A. Mikulin, who recruited him to work at OKB-300 as his deputy, and from here, it was quite literally off to the races. Tumansky essentially ran the workshop under Mikulin during the post-war turbojet arms race, taking a direct role in the development of reverse-engineered German engines, and eventually, as mentioned above, he troubleshooted and ultimately led the effort to bring the AM-5 into reliable operation. With this success under his belt, just before Mikulin was removed and he got promoted, he immediately went to the drawing board to design his own turbojet engine, something bigger and better than anything built in the USSR before. Its intended purpose was for the Yak-25's high-altitude recon variant, with provisions made for an utterly monstrous afterburner to employ in a fighter or interceptor airframe. The engine in question was the Tumansky R-11, and after a rough initial development process which, as per usual in the Soviet aero engine industry, involved many fiery disasters, to the point that testing on the MiG-21 prototype was halted entirely for a while, which Artyom Mikoyan handled with his usual poise and grace, the production R-11-300 would become arguably one of the most successful afterburning jets in the history of aviation, with a developmental lifespan measured in decades through various revisions, powering both the MiG-21 and the Su-15 Interceptor, as well as the entire line of Yakovlev's twin-engined fighter bombers. Except now, after achieving such a spectacular feat of engineering, he was informed by the Council of Ministers and the Central Institute for Aviation Motors, CIAM, that they needed something even bigger to counter the impending threat of the Blackbird and the Valkyrie. They needed an engine that could get a fighter-sized aircraft to Mach 3 at 100,000 feet. Keep in mind that this is still the late 1950s. The technical challenge of making an engine for this is borderline fantasy. Somehow, it's still a fantasy for most people even today. Yet, as fate would have it, Tumansky had just the thing to meet their requirements. You see, earlier in 1957, the Soviet nuclear forces were undergoing an institutional crisis. If you recall from the previous entry on Soviet Interceptors, several design bureaus had been assigned to build strategic bombers that could reach the United States. This seemed to be a simple enough exercise on the surface, but as development went on, it became apparent that none of the jet-powered bombers could make the journey and return safely due to the inefficiency of Soviet turbojets in terms of fuel consumption. Furthermore, air-to-air refueling was still in its infancy at this stage, and to conduct refueling operations on that scale would be beyond their operational expertise. Therefore, the only bomber that could successfully reach the United States and employ nuclear weapons was the Tu-95, which, as the observant amongst you will notice, is a turboprop. Now imagine, if you will, a turboprop bomber flying through contested airspace in the age of jet fighters and the Americans' new Nike series of surface-to-air missiles. Now, funnily enough, Khrushchev's proposed solution to this, and the reason why both the major powers poured money into the space race, was ICBMs. And this is indeed the correct solution vis-a-vis a nuclear deterrent. The problem was the R-7 ICBM that formed the first generation of these weapons took an entire day to prepare for launch, and they couldn't stay ready as the fuel would eat through the fuel tanks. Not exactly something you can leave prepped in case of an emergency. The Soviets basically had to give the entire ballistic missile force a 24-hour heads up, just in case a nuclear war was about to start, which naturally was observed by the U-2s and satellites, causing the Yanks to panic and raise their own DEFCON level. This is one of the main reasons the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. The Soviets put medium-range missiles in Cuba to get around this whole problem, and when things went further south than Antarctica, American intelligence assets saw all their R-7 missiles being prepped for launch, sending Washington into oh shit mode. But the thing is, the Soviets didn't want to resort to the Cuban gambit initially. Instead, they wanted to develop a quick reaction weapon system capable of reaching the United States that could avoid interception and strike their targets accurately. So they asked the Tupolev Bureau to design, and no, I'm not kidding, an intercontinental Mark III cruise missile. You heard correctly. They wanted to build a drone the size of a medium bomber with a massive engine armed with a nuclear warhead. The idea being it would fly so high and so fast and then be deployed so quickly that the Americans wouldn't have time to intercept it. Plus, the new experimental Midas early warning satellites wouldn't be able to pick them up, and the over-the-horizon radars set up to watch for ICBMs would most likely filter them out, giving the Soviets a theoretical first strike capability. So, the Tupolev 121 Intercontinental Cruise Missile project was born. And then subsequently cancelled because the technology being developed for this thing was insane. The missile would melt itself, the autopilot and navigation system were exceedingly complex, including an ingenious astral navigation system designated Earth AI, which makes me wonder if OKB-300 can sue Google. And let's be honest, the logistics of this would be utterly ludicrous, while rocket designs under Korolev and Glushko were making enough progress to resolve the R-7's latent issues in subsequent missiles, which of course they did, leading to the Cuban gambit, etc., etc. Yet the design did get to the prototype stage and achieved a degree of success, so they turned it into a recon drone, and with such a success recognized the engine required to power it also got noticed. That engine was the Tumansky R-15-300. Here is a photo of adult humans sitting in its jet pipe for scale. Yes, that is a MiG-25. Yes, this is the Foxbat's engine. It had to start somewhere, and oh baby, here it is. And I adore this thing. Easily my favorite jet engine ever built, and let me tell you why. It was the first Soviet jet engine to have a fully automated control system able to adjust every component to optimize performance at all phases of flight: takeoff, cruise, combat, and war emergency power. It had a 5-stage compressor and a massive combustion chamber, not to mention the single largest afterburning chamber in the history of turbojet engines up to this point, with a fuel flow at max operation of over 600 pounds an hour, generating a total of 22,500 pounds of thrust. To put that in perspective, that's comparable to the early versions of the SR-71's J-58 in an engine with none of the fancy gadgets. And in case of an emergency, it could go even further beyond that. Though there was of course a downside to this level of power, using the currently available Soviet technology in terms of engine construction, regards alloys, compression ratios and the like. The first models of the R-15-300 had a lifespan of around 25 hours. This thing generated so much power, it slowly dismantled itself in regular operation, and in emergency mode, it literally melted itself, forcing the engine to be replaced, as no amount of overhaul could save it. Which, while suboptimal in terms of reliability and budgetary constraints, this state of affairs, it has to be acknowledged, is metal as fuck. It goes so hard, it disintegrates while sending whatever it's powering into the stratosphere at Mach Jesus. That is incredible, I don't care who you are. These days, due to current events in Eastern Europe, it is a common derogatory term to use the term orc, but in this case, it really is appropriate. This is raw engineering prowess with sheer fucking will. Push big red button, thing go fast. Very fast. Impossibly fast. And Tumansky was just getting started. Through various generations of development, the R-15-300 could be tuned to different altitudes based on the mission profile the aircraft was expected to fulfill, and naturally, the primary variant was tuned to high altitudes. Eventually, after a lot of hard work involving trial and an awful lot of error, the service life was increased to around 150 hours and an uninterrupted afterburner runtime of 40 minutes before it exploded. Though that's assuming you're on ordinary afterburner. Emergency afterburner was more like 8 minutes and then the whole thing melted. It's this capability that gave the MiG-25 its legendary performance and sustained top speed. The question is though, how did Tumansky refine the R-15 to achieve that incredible engineering masterclass? Well, he needed a testbed, an aircraft to refine the design and become the Soviet Union's first true supersonic heavy interceptor. And just as they'd done for 20 years, and would do for another 20, the Council of Ministers turned to none other than Artyom Mikoyan and the MiG Bureau to make it happen. Also, apologies in advance, the visuals from here on out will be a bit boring, seeing as the Soviets, as usual, didn't film or photograph their top secret prototypes much, but I've done my best. But it will be a lot of panning shots of the same few photos, I'm sorry. As Comrade K mentioned before, the Soviets had started developing the truly revolutionary GCI command system, Vosduk-1, complete with a mechanical data link powered by communist witchcraft, and they had already begun the preliminary integration of it across the PVO. There were also numerous other GCI systems in use, some automated, some manual, but all integrated as part of the Soviet air defense network, stuff like Lazur and Dal, etc. Yet of course, as you can see, with this and every other Soviet defense contract, why have one streamlined program when you can have several hundred? And so, in the mid-1950s, after the sound barrier had been reliably broken and Mach 2 aircraft were becoming a known engineering quantity, the PVO put in a request to the various design bureaus to start working on an ultra-high-speed, high-altitude, heavy interceptor, with a fully automated air intercept system compatible with the PVO's GCI infrastructure. Codenamed Urugan, or Hurricane, this project was assigned to National Institute 2 for the complex avionics and the MiG Bureau for the aircraft. Naturally, as we discussed at the beginning, the limitations of Soviet technology and the unerring savagery of Newtonian physics meant these planes would have to be big to house all the gear required, and as such their engines needed to be bigger still. This meant more fuel, and so the spiral begins anew. Yet this made the calculus rather simple. Unlike fighters like the MiG-21, this thing really didn't need to be super agile. It just needed to carry huge air-to-air missiles at insanely high speeds while operating at extreme altitude. With all the guidance and control systems inbuilt, it would be theoretically able to operate as part of the GCI network, or even semi-autonomously in the outer regions of the Soviet Union. So all they needed was sleek aerodynamics, lots of power, and lots of fuel. And given the success of their regular fighters, MiG made the logical conclusion. We know how to achieve this. Let's just scale these bad boys up and full fucking send. This decision led to the development of the first generation of MiG heavy interceptors with the designation I-3. The plan was simple. Take the overall design features of their latest fighter, which in 1954 was the MiG-19, make it bigger, longer, and sleeker to accommodate all the new equipment, and put a more powerful single motor in the rear to maximize performance and range. Combine that with the automated interception system, and theoretically all the pilot has to do is take off, follow the steering commands, hook onto a ground station for terminal attack guidance, and once visual is established, maneuver his aircraft to align the target in his gun sight and fire the 3 massive 30mm cannons to shoot it down. Pretty straightforward. The benefit of this would be removing the dangerous problem we spoke about last episode, with the pilot having to constantly be staring at his radar screen while hand-flying a supersonic Slav rocket at the edge of space. The workload for the pilot is drastically reduced and everything is a hell of a lot safer. They knew everything they needed to know to get this project going. Now the problem was actually building the thing, which, once again, is where they hit problems. You see, MiG built the aircraft just fine. Here it is. Look at it. It's beautiful. It's like a majestic union between a MiG-19 and a Sukhoi Su-9. Now, given we're on episode 5, I want everyone watching this to take a wild guess at which component of this flight program wasn't ready. Fingers on buzzers, are you ready? Everyone? Of course it was the engine. The team at Klimov was working frantically on their VK3. It was powerful, it was complex, it was state-of-the-art, and as a result, utterly unworkable. Once again, Soviet engine development kicks its aircraft designers in the nuts. So MiG started work on another variant of their interceptor with more advanced features, such as the new Almaz radar, as well as a working prototype of Urugan-1. They got a whole new plane ready to go, and the VK3 still wasn't ready. So they built a third one out of an unfinished prototype. And that didn't have a VK3 available for it.
But the fourth one stayed up.
But finally, by July 1956, a VK3 arrived at Factory 155 to complete the aircraft, which by now was designated the I-3U, and test flights began. And then immediately stopped because the VK3 broke. So they sent it back to get it fixed. Then they got it back and began testing once again. And then once again the engine broke, which meant it got sent back once again, returned once again, tested, and yeah, you get the idea. They only managed to make 10 flights with this aircraft before they had to put a moratorium on all flight testing for half a year. They couldn't fly this thing for half a year. And so, by 1958, the I-3U had made a total of 44 flights in its entire life. And while the raw performance was actually quite good, with a top speed of over 1,200 miles an hour, everything else on the aircraft wasn't. And as a result, time, technology, but most importantly, the political leadership, had moved on. They needed a working aircraft, and this thing wasn't going to be ready on any sort of reasonable timescale. So, halfway through the development process, the Council of Ministers once again issued a directive to MiG, ordering him to convert one of the airframes from the high-powered Klimov VK3 to the same engine used by Sukhoi's new aircraft, the AL-7F. Because, amazingly, Lyulka's engine actually existed, and even better, more incredibly, worked. Kind of. But at least this would get the Urugan interceptor system active in the PVO's fleet while allowing MiG to actually fly their new flying machine. A truly radical concept, but, you know, hey, this is the Soviet Union, you take what you can get. This aircraft, designated the I-7, was configured to fire the first generation of Soviet air-to-air missiles designed by the various OKBs working on them, including our boy, Matos Biznovat. I promise we're going to do a video about him eventually. Some of them were built specifically to work with the Urugan system. In the I-7's case, the K-6 missile was chosen as its primary weapon. And here, looking at photos, you can really start to see the gradual evolution of Soviet fighter design, especially in the case of the MiG Bureau. The wings are still decisively that of the MiG-19, but look at the fuselage, the tail, the various accoutrements. By 1957, we are starting to see, through the work of Sagi and the research done by Sukhoi, the first glimmers of the F-4 Phantom's arch-nemesis shining through. Without a doubt, the MiG-21 owes a lot to this program. But not its performance. Because ladies, gentlemen, and themtlemen, though slightly out of place, it is finally time for the line you've all been waiting for. You've been so patient, and such good listeners. So are you ready? Say it with me now. And then it got worse. On April 22nd, 1957, which by coincidence or design is Lenin's birthday, the I-7U prototype was wheeled out of the hangar for its first test flight. All systems showed nominal. The test pilot, Comrade Georgy Mosolov, started her up and took off into the skies of a sunny Soviet spring. And the I-7 was utter dogshit. In the world's least surprising turn of events, the AL-7F, while a fantastic engine, when it worked, was still a brand new engine with all the issues that entails. Yet the main issue was, it was designed for an aircraft 2/3 the size and half the weight. It worked beautifully in the Sukhois, but they were conventional designs, not giant testbeds for an entirely new system, complete with clunky experimental air-to-air missiles, avionics, and a GCI system. Worse still, after only a few test flights through the month of May, the I-7 suffered a landing gear failure in June that ended with the wings bending in on themselves, crippling the aircraft for the rest of the year. It wouldn't be until January of 1958 that the aircraft returned to service, by which time Mikoyan had decided to terminate the project and use the I-7 airframe to test out newer technologies in preparation for the construction of a brand new design. A brand new design to be powered by Tumansky's R-15-300. The technologies under development in question were a development of the Urugan system, The rapid pace of technology during the Cold War is truly remarkable. So much so it would occasionally exceed exponential growth, thanks in no small part to talented engineers such as our friend from last episode, Comrade Tikhomirov of NII-17, who was developing the air intercept radar component of Urugan 5. Urugan 5, unlike its first iteration, was not simply a GCI system. It was a complete evolution that automated not only the interception process, but the entire engagement from launch to recovery. The issue is, of course, that this would require an entirely new avionics package. In fact, it would take the most advanced avionics package in the world at the time. It had a fully integrated multifunction autopilot, a weapons computer capable of firing multiple second-generation air-to-air missiles, a complex flight computer integrated with the avionics package, and most impressively of all, a state-of-the-art fire control radar with anti-electronic countermeasure capability and double the range of previous sets. But most vitally of all, every component was considerably lighter than earlier models. Yet naturally, all of these systems were brand new, using technology on the very cutting edge, in some cases superior to that of the West even. However, they were, like all systems before them, forced to contend with the Soviet Union's inferior manufacturing and high technology sector. It would be a long and arduous development process, hence why MiG decided to repurpose the I-7U as a testbed, giving it the new name of I-75. Man, you know what? The Soviets really should have started giving their prototypes cool nicknames like NATO. It would make keeping track of them easier at least. And as if to make Mikoyan's life even harder, the Council of Ministers ordered him to build prototypes to test not only Urugan, but all the different variants of missile under development as well, not to mention an independent airframe integration with Vosduk-1. Nevertheless, work would continue on the I-75, including a new, more powerful variant of the AL-7F. The performance it granted, combined with the reduced weight of Urugan 5, allowed it to reach speeds of around Mach 2.2. However, this engine was also fitted to the brand new Sukhoi 9, developed from the Sukhoi 7, which, while not equipped with all the fancy gadgets, operated on proven technology and was readily available to intercept U-2s, hustlers, and everyone's favourite geriatric war criminal. So the I-75 never really evolved beyond its role as a testbed. Yet as the 1960s began, intelligence reports regarding the XB-70 and the SR-71 grew far more frequent. First Directorate KGB had sources everywhere, and the news they were getting was rather alarming. Thus, the directive for the new MiG interceptors was amended to include some absolutely ridiculous statistics. The new aircraft had to be capable of intercepting an enemy aircraft operating at 85,000 feet, going Mach 1.5, which doesn't sound like a huge ask considering the numbers we're working with. Until you realize that the requirements for this capability included an 80% kill rate in case of pursuit. They didn't simply want a fighter that could meet the enemy in the middle. Oh no. They wanted an aircraft that could be taken by surprise on the ground, take off quickly, and then catch a bandit going nearly Mach 2 in space. They wanted to take off and pursue a target going Mach 2. The performance required would be utterly ridiculous, ludicrous even. It would need to go at least Mach 2.5. Yet with the new Tumansky R-15 and the latest aerodynamic data gleaned from their work on the brand new MiG-21, Mikoyan was confident that they could provide. And provide they would. Ladies, gentlemen, bitches, bros, and non-binary hoes, I am delighted to share with you my favorite Soviet prototype ever constructed. Yes, even cooler than the Ekranoplan. Behold! The YE-152 Interceptor, or as it's known in English-speaking circles, the Tube. This aircraft, as you can probably deduce, is all engine, baby. Besides the crucial avionics, every single consideration was made exclusively to facilitate a greater top speed. Vertical slit intakes around the afterburner chamber to increase airflow and boost thrust. stainless steel alloy leading edges on the flight surfaces to cope with the extreme heat of higher Mach numbers, while the rest of the airframe was made out of the highest grade of aviation aluminium the Soviet Union had available. All of it powered by the brand new R-15-300 with its whopping 22,500 pounds of thrust, which gives it a thrust to weight ratio of just over 1.1. And that's gross takeoff weight, by the way. So as the fuel burns off, which given this thing's power it does rather quickly, it gets even faster. This thing had 5 fuel tanks totaling 1,000 gallons of fuel, or around 4,200 liters. And in full burner, it could go through that very quickly. And the technology doesn't stop there. It had a multi-position shot cone in the intake, which would eventually house the radar, capable of automatically adjusting based on the Mach number, complete with a series of anti-surge inlets on either side of the intake. Yet despite the old adage that a brick can fly with enough thrust, a brick, the YE-150, certainly was not. Using an ultra-refined variation of the MiG-21's already thin delta wing and an aggressively swept vertical stabilizer with a ventral fin, the entirety of the drag on this aircraft was confined solely to its frontal service area and the 2 underwing pylons for the intended K-6 air-to-air guided missiles. Literally every other system, no matter how small, was housed internally. No surface drag of any kind was permitted, to the extent that they even made the cockpit canopy in a single piece of laminated heat-resistant glass that opens from the front F-35 style and melds seamlessly into the fuselage. They did this in 1960. They can't even do that properly with the Su-57 today, for fuck's sake. This thing is an engineering marvel, and they were taking no chances. They had the need for speed. Except, after testing all the systems were functional, they started the taxiing tests, and the R-15-300 immediately failed. So despite being fully ready to go, the YE-150 spent 18 months sitting in a hangar getting constantly tweaked, doing absolutely nothing. It wouldn't be until the 8th of July 1960 that this aircraft would begin its flight testing, which immediately started to go wrong due to the hydraulic actuators on the control surfaces not being configured correctly. But by now, all the design bureaus had experience with issues like this, especially Lavashkin, and after a quick round of tweaks, the prototype was back in the air. And then immediately grounded again because the R-15's main shaft and gearbox disintegrated, resulting in an emergency landing and another engine replacement. But finally, on January 18th, 1961, Tumansky had delivered a semi-reliable engine, the airframe was checked, rechecked, and prepped for a full flight test program. And the results were, even by the expectations of the designers, and even by today's standards, truly astonishing. Over a year of testing, it made 42 flights examining every component except the armament. During these test flights, the YE-150 achieved a top speed of 1,800 miles an hour, or Mach 2.65, while flying at 65,000 feet. And the wildest thing is, this wasn't even at full throttle. It could have gone even faster, but they didn't want to wreck the engine. Across these tests, only one major mishap occurred when the braking parachute failed on landing and the aircraft rolled off the end of the runway, flipping on its back in the process. Thankfully, the soft snow and topsoil slowed it down while reducing the impact, meaning it was fixed within a week of the incident and sent back to continue testing. By the end of that testing, they had confirmed a ceiling altitude of 74,000 feet, a top speed in excess of Mach 2.7, and a climb rate double that of the MiG-21. The MiG-21 is a rocket ship, and this thing had double the climb rate, reaching 50,000 feet in 2.5 minutes. This thing was absolutely nuts. Unfortunately, though, it didn't have any weapons on it yet, and so it didn't really count as a real interceptor prototype. Thus, it was time to remedy that issue And in that effort, the Soviets ran into the debate that still rages to this very day. A debate thoroughly poisoned by the ilk of Pierre Sprey, Boyd, and others. But alas, it is a debate nonetheless. To gun or not to gun? Well, as we know, the USSR is absolutely insane in its appropriations process, and as mentioned before, they asked for a prototype for every weapon system. And this included, and I shit you not, a Mark 2.5 gun interceptor. Now I have to point out, no photos exist of this variant, but apparently they decided to fit a revolving autocannon, not a Gatling design, an actual revolving autocannon. And I'm not sure what the configuration was. One document I found said it looked like this thing. Yeah, that's a MiG-17 with a rotating turret so it could strafe ground targets while remaining in level flight. This was real, it did exist, it was, as the youth say, a thing. However, it was set up kind of similar to a bomber's gun turret, so the gun could adjust itself in relation to the radar's targeting solution. But another document I found said it was a stationary mount, and the primary document that I used said that it had like a chin turret configuration with a 60-degree off-bore sight arc, so they could get up underneath it like German night fighters used to do, or get into lag pursuit during a fight and shoot that way. Whatever the configuration, when they tested it on a mock-up of the nose section, it was discovered to not only not work, but threaten to disintegrate the aircraft and send the wreckage through the intake and into the engine and exploding everything. Plus, the math said, given how fast they were going, a gun solution would be practically redundant anyway, if not endangering the aircraft into shooting itself down. So a missiles-only setup was selected going forward. Even so, this project had revealed advantages during the redesign of the nose, and so a reworked shock cone as well as a brand new pitot tube configuration was adopted going forward for the other prototypes. Yet as we have established, the R-15-300 engine, giving them the required power, was still having major teething problems, and Urugan 5's GCI component was lagging behind so badly that it was superseded by the Dahl GCI system. Thus, the Council of Ministers altered their requirements for the next prototype, codenamed YE-152, to use two Tumansky R-11 engines from the MiG-21 and the Dahl GCI system in order to get an aircraft into service as quickly as possible. And at the same time, because they love making things easy, they also mandated that MiG work on their own missile project, designated the K9-155. 155, of course, standing for OKB-155, which was the MiG Bureau's official designation in Soviet records, due to the Soviet bureaucracy's utterly maniacal need for spreadsheets rather than names. Seriously. Look through all of Soviet society, just look at it. Instead of the Zaitsev Memorial Hospital or something like that, you'll see Volgograd State Hospital number 4, the State School for the Trades number 15, etc., etc. It's rather depressing. Anyway, Soviet missile technology had started developing rapidly in the late 50s to early 60s, and the K9 was rather impressive. It had all-aspect capability, a top speed of over 3,000 miles an hour, and a 60-pound warhead with a 30-meter fragmentation range. Unfortunately, the same issues that plagued Soviet radars and computers also plagued the seeker heads and their missiles, and as such the effective kill range was limited to between 5 to 10 miles. And of course, once again, it got worse. Because all the Urugan 5 systems that were meant to work with this missile, the ones being developed specifically for this absolute monster of an interceptor, they all stalled in the R&D phase, and so the entire project got cancelled anyway. Meaning not only did it kill the missile, it killed the YE-152 as well. But that wasn't the end of the story. They still had value as testbeds, and so work continued through 1960 and 61. The YE-152A9, as it would eventually be called, or, rather inaccurately by NATO, the MiG-23 Flipper, ended up having inferior performance to the R-15-300 powered variant by a significant degree. It's also the only model of the YE-152 series of aircraft that we have footage of. And that was it. Yep. That's all. That flyby at Tushino is literally the only proof of its existence on film. But that was probably for the best, considering that it was essentially MiG's interpretation of the Sukhoi 15 Flagon with less powerful engines. In fact, Sukhoi was already working on interceptor projects at the same time and running into the same issues. But they already had working aircraft filling the role in the Su-11, so they were a step ahead. The one good thing the YE-152A9 did do is serve as a testbed for the Vosduk-1 GCI system and its future integration with the entire interceptor fleet. It also convinced the team at MiG to adapt the design to wingtip missiles for better aerodynamic performance as opposed to underwing pylons. And of course, with the more reliable engines, ironically enough, this aircraft flew before all the other prototypes, so it got a head start. And all of these decisions, all of these innovations, one through extensive testing, culminated into what would become the ultimate form of the design. Behold, the glorious YE-152-1. Here it was, the complete package. The missiles, the avionics, the right engine, everything was in place. And it was a record setter. The YE-152-1 made 67 test flights in total, and in that time it set 3 world speed records for a fighter aircraft that wouldn't be beaten until its more famous successor came along. It achieved speeds of Mach 2.3 with a full fuel and weapons load just minutes after takeoff. It achieved an average speed record over distance for a single-engine turbojet aircraft that still stands today. And it was, in my opinion, one of the most badass-looking aircraft ever built. Just look at it. It's like something out of Star Wars. That's why I opened this video calling it the Starfighter. That is literally the Starfighter she tells you not to worry about, because, I mean, look. God damn, it's gorgeous. However, one more time, just for tradition's sake, and then it got worse. It turns out that the one-piece canopy glass that gave it its sleek appearance was not properly treated in its manufacturing process to resist the ungodly amount of kinetic heating it experienced at high speed. And in the effort of reaching those high speeds, the R-15-300 developed multiple oil leaks, melted itself, and superheated so badly it suffered critical existence failure in its turbine blades, and foddered itself. Multiple times. And yet, the data collected during this extensive test regimen proved invaluable in ironing out all of these problems on subsequent models. They also proved crucial in developing new alloys and heat reduction strategies to cope with the stresses of ultra-high-speed flight, while simultaneously troubleshooting the fleet-wide integration of the various GCI systems used across the PVO into one holistic system. And in the end, it would pave the way for its final form, the experimental testbed designated E-166, or the YE-152M, set apart by its miniature canards and being primarily armed with the missiles that would eventually become the primary armament of the Tu-128. But sadly, that's all it would end up being. A testbed remnant of a cancelled program, exceedingly capable, yet ultimately useless. In the end, the YE-152, record-breaking superjet that it was, would be relegated to a museum exhibit at the Soviet Museum of Sciences. A showpiece with its records proudly painted on the side of the aircraft, boasting the prowess of Soviet aviation technology. And yet now it resides at the National Aviation Museum in Moscow, rusting away in the open, forgotten and abandoned, as Putin puts all the money needed for the museum into his special military operation, or into his gigantic propaganda showpiece, Patriot Park, a place which has no exhibit for the YE-152. But now, hopefully, the legacy of the aircraft lives on. As far as I'm aware, this video is the only fully dedicated look at the YE-150 series of aircraft on this platform, so I hope I have somewhat remedied the injustice done to her. Yet more importantly, far more important, the YE-150 series of interceptors would form the bedrock of all future Soviet interceptor projects. Its speed, its avionics. Without their development, Sukhoi and Tupolev wouldn't have had the success they ended up having. But more important, perhaps, no actually, definitely, the most important thing of all. The research done on the YE-152 would give rise to a new MiG design. An aircraft unlike anything the world had ever seen. A record breaker. A killer. An aircraft that struck terror deep into the hearts of the entire NATO alliance. An aircraft which still holds accolades to this very day. And despite the derision and revision of modern pop histories, she remains, in my opinion, one of the greatest aircraft ever built. But we shall hear her story another time.